Celts have been obsessed with the idea of invasion. And the story of the arrival of the Anglo-Saxons has long been accepted as a part of our history. I'm going to show that the myth of the Anglo-Saxon invasion is just a tale. Leading-edge archaeology is beginning to re-examine the dramatic changes that took place in this country in the centuries after the Roman troops departed. And a very different story to the one which we have become accustomed is emerging. Just before World War II, archaeologists in Suffolk uncovered one of the greatest discoveries of our time: the Anglo-Saxon burial mounds at Sutton Hoo. Helen Geek explains.
Mrs. Pretty decided to investigate the burial mounds that were on her property. She rang up Ipswich Museum and asked for advice on a freelance archaeologist. It seems like another world where a landowner can simply employ an archaeologist to open their burial mounds. But that's what happened. In Mound 1 over there, he discovered an intact ship and a burial chamber. When news of this got out, archaeologists from Cambridge University and the British Museum came in to help, and the most fabulous, extraordinary archaeological treasure was discovered there.
Excavations revealed the burial chamber of a person in a wooden ship. He was accompanied by a wealth of fabulous objects. This was the grave of a very rich man.
Helmets are incredibly rare. Special headgear seems to be appropriate for a king, as it still is today. He's got other things like the strange whetstone that's made into a sceptre. It's got polish in the middle where your hand could have held it, and a little cup which could sit on your knee, so you can hold your sceptre like a modern king. Some people see a very strong Swedish influence. Some people see a very strong classical Byzantine influence. And other people say that he's got a bit of everything. He's trying out a lot of different methods of making us see that he's an important ruler of the East Angles.
By the 7th century, parts of Britain had become a series of politically powerful kingdoms, later to be known as England. Do you suppose a boatload of Anglo-Saxon royal family came sailing up the Devon and thought, whoopee, this is the place for me, got off the boat and set up their kingdom here?
The origin myths that we have, recorded by people like Bede, do seem to indicate that in the 5th century, boatloads of royalty did row up and think, well, I will create my kingdom here. But we just don't have any archaeological evidence to back that up at all. What seems much more likely is that by some process of internal social development, kings arose at some point in the late 6th century and then decided to kind of create this origin myth to explain where they'd come from. Probably they just murdered and fought their way to the top, but they wanted to say that they'd always been royal. In fact, they're descended from the gods, you know.
Sutton Hoo is the most elaborate of a number of rich Anglo-Saxon burials over the south and east of Britain. Archaeologists are divided about where these powerful new leaders came from. Heinrich Harker favours the idea they were invaders.
Until Sutton Hoo was found, Tablow was the richest Anglo-Saxon grave in England. These big Anglo-Saxon burials of the 7th century were very often located on the tops of ridges, taking up a dominant position in the landscape demonstrates who you are, who your family was.
Heinrich Harker believes an invasion is the best way of explaining the changes in culture that took place after the Romans left. Why do we have to have migrations? It's very difficult to prove that people came here in large numbers from abroad.
Francis, I believe you can demonstrate that this is still, given the evidence, the best possible explanation. Your argument is we do not need migrations to explain culture change. This is essentially the underlying argument.
Yes.
I agree with that. And actually, if at the moment you look to Russia, post-Soviet Russia, you see a huge culture change, but it is not brought in by immigrant Westerners.
Exactly.
It is marketed there. Of course, you can say there is no proof that they came here, and I accept that. We cannot trace them across the North Sea, but it is still the best explanation.
Heinrich, I'd love to agree with you, only I can't see any outsiders would have come here without there being one hell of a fight. And there is no evidence for a struggle. If people move on to my land, I'm not happy about that.
If you're there, you are not.
Right, so you think that people would actually have moved out? Because there isn't much evidence for that.
After the collapse of a civilization, you do have population decline. If there is population decline, there was also space, more space in the landscape than there was in the Roman system.
I don't believe that there was a hole in British society. If anything, you know, the taxes were removed, I would have thought people said, whoopee, it's Christmas, I don't have to pay taxes, I'm much better off. And so when the Romans left, people actually probably got more prosperous.
Very much a farmer's view, I would have thought. I like that.
Farmer's view or not, the invasion explanation just isn't enough. Whenever archaeologists can't explain a period of social change or innovation, they reach for the catch-all explanation: new people, invasion. But there isn't actually any evidence to support this story. We just can't prove it. Science, however, is trying to. At University College London, Professor of Genetics Mark Thomas and his team have conducted a survey of the DNA in the British Isles. The male genetic marker is known as a Y chromosome. A father passes a largely unchanged copy of his own Y chromosome to his son. It is a very good way of tracing ancestry through history. By comparing Y chromosome information from different populations, Mark has tried to establish how closely the populations are related. He discovered that there was an unusually high similarity between DNA from Britain and parts of Holland.
Within England, all the towns look very similar, but different to the Welsh towns. And the more remarkable feature was the incredible similarity between the English towns, genetically, and the Frisians. In fact, we couldn't statistically tell any difference between them.
This suggests the native British Y chromosome has, at some point in history, been mixed with that of people from Northern Europe. Complex statistics were used to work out when this genetic mix might have happened.
We conclude we would need the mass migration in the last 2,500 years that was 100% replacement, or if it was less, it would have to have been more recently. And if we assume that that mass migration was the Anglo-Saxon mass migration, then we estimate that that replacement must have been between 50 and 100%.
The sheer completeness of this population change really does conflict with the archaeological evidence. 3 million people shoved out.
Well, they don't show that. Now, we can't say anything about what the process was. As I said, that could be push-in, or it could be slaughtering, or it could be something much more benign, like just economic differences between the different populations, and over time a gradual replacement. We can't really say how it happened.
But another team of geneticists in the same department as Mark have conducted a similar survey and come up with very different results. They conclude that the native British Y chromosome has not been largely replaced in southern and eastern England. Furthermore, they stated that it's not possible to distinguish between the genetic influence of the Anglo-Saxons and that of the Vikings, who definitely did invade Britain in the 8th and 9th centuries. I just don't think that we should rely on these genetic versions of history on their own, especially when two similar studies produce such different results. I'm also pretty suspicious of simple explanations in complex times. The dramatic changes that took place in the 5th and 6th centuries laid the foundations for the modern identity of this country. I'm going to show these changes were not the result of mass invasions. And in revising this powerful origin myth, I will discover who we, the English, really are. On the south coast of Hampshire, at the entrance to a natural harbour, is one of the best preserved Roman buildings in Britain.
This is Porchester Castle. It's one of a series of coastal forts built by the Romans in the 3rd and 4th centuries. They're known as Saxon shore forts because it's still widely accepted that they were constructed to keep out marauding Anglo-Saxon bands from the other side of the channel. But in actual fact, they may have been used for a very different purpose.
In total, 11 shore forts skirt the southern and eastern coast. From Porchester in the south, around the coast, these shore forts have been taken as an imposing reminder of the Anglo-Saxon threat, all the way up to Brancaster in Norfolk. One of the most easterly of these forts, Birr Castle, still commands the landscape.
All of this, all of the green fields over there,
would have been what was termed the Great Estuary. Combination of open water and marsh and intertidal creeks, that kind of thing. Probably until 10th, 12th century.
Andrew Pearson has been re-examining the forts and has come to the surprising conclusion that they may have nothing to do with Anglo-Saxons.
I think that the traditional view of these sites is that they are a defence against pirate raiders from across the Channel. From Saxony, from Frisia, from Jutland, basically from the peoples who are, in later periods, going to colonise Britain.
The name Saxon Shore Fort actually comes from a Roman military list, which was translated in the 16th century by the famous antiquarian William Camden. What the term Saxon refers to is unclear.
What Camden said pretty much went as archaeological fact for many sort of centuries to come, really. I think also what he hit on was a very evocative idea. It's very dramatic. It's also very simple, that these forts are put up as a defence against the Saxons. The count is called the Count of the Saxon Shore. Now, whether that means it is the shore being attacked by the Saxons or settled by the Saxons, really we just don't know.
Andrew has found that the huge walls are actually better suited to protecting goods kept inside the forts, rather than attacking enemies from outside.
Well, I think these sites are doing much more than defending the coastline. If the Saxons came raiding, it wouldn't have been monthly, it may not have even been every year or every 10 years. So, in terms of what these forts do, I think it's much more likely that they have a major economic role, or perhaps a supply role, rather than this kind of defensive function that's ascribed to them normally.
So what you seem to be suggesting then is that these forts could have been used actually to help trade from out of Britain rather than stop people coming in.
Yes, I think rather than trying to block access to the interior, as is perhaps traditionally thought, in fact these are quite the opposite insofar as materials and goods are coming here and then being shipped outwards and beyond into the empire as a whole.
Andrew has found no archaeological evidence that these forts were built to defend against an Anglo-Saxon invasion. So what is the evidence for invasion?